Lgx Data Hub allows you to analyze structured pre- and post-issuance information on a wide range of sustainable securities. Bring the value of sustainability data into your investments. Go to lgxhub.com.
Welcome to our first panel discussion on the green recovery. We've just heard from Sir Ronald Cohen about the possibility of a new capitalism in which companies and investors take into account the needs of society as well as the pursuit of profit. But he's not the only one suggesting that this moment could be a time of change. Countries all over the world have been battered by the coronavirus. It has wrecked industries, destroyed livelihoods, and left large sections of society with deep fears for the future. An enormous response is needed from governments, monetary authorities, banks, the corporate sector to put the economy back on its feet. But the pandemic has not only been damaging, it has also, paradoxically, created hope. Hope that we can rebuild society better than it was before, more able to withstand and respond to pandemics, first of all, but more than that, a fairer society. COVID-19 has brought home how many of the lowest paid workers are also the most essential to our way of life and take the biggest risks. The environment too is central. It's clear that the worse climate change gets and the more we damage the ecosystems we depend on, the more we will suffer from catastrophes like pandemics. Many are convinced that we need not just a recovery, but a green recovery, and that markets, financial markets, have a part to play. So, to help find out what part our markets can play, I've got a great selection of panelists with me today, this morning. Why don't we meet them? So, let's start with Alyssa.
Thanks very much. My name's Ellis. I'm Head of European and UK Public Policy for the Principles for Responsible Investment. We're an international investor body with around 3,000 members around the world. So I follow all aspects of European sustainable finance and sustainability policy, and have spent the last couple of years working quite in depth on a series of expert groups as well.
Thank you. Julie.
Julie Becker. I'm the Deputy CEO of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, and I'm also the founder of the Luxembourg Green Exchange, the first and still leading platform in the world dedicated mainly to green, social and sustainability securities.
Thank you. Mervyn?
Hi, I'm Mervyn Tang. I'm the Global Head of ESG Research at Fitch Ratings, the credit rating agency. My team looks at thematic and cross-sector issues and how they affect credit. So things like how climate change regulation is evolving, how water scarcity is materializing into potential risks. And so I really think about ESG issues from a credit point of view.
Thank you. Karen, last but not least, definitely not least.
Thank you. I'm Karen Ellis, Director of Sustainable Economy at WWF UK, where we have a whole programme of work looking at how to promote economic and financial system reforms that will achieve greater sustainability, and also working with the global WWF network on how to promote a green recovery.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. To the audience, please don't forget we're going to have a live Q&A session immediately after this. So if you have any questions for our panelists, and indeed if we say anything that you want to find out more about, then ask a question and we'll answer it as soon as we're done. But I want to start now by asking our panelists to try and set the scene by asking, do we think it's possible, or just wishful thinking, that we are at a genuine turning point at which markets will start to serve humanity in a fuller sense? I'd like to start actually with Alyssa on this question, if that's possible.
Very happy to. I think this has been something of a stock-taking moment for many in the industry. It's increased awareness of the extent to which we depend on environmental and social systems for our way of life, and the fragility of those systems has come into relief, I think. So it's been a moment to take stock and to think about that. What I think is interesting is that there is probably more flexibility than people realize already for investors and corporates to act in ways that are beneficial to society and the environment. And so I think this is a profound opportunity for a cultural change as well as a regulatory change.
Okay, thank you. from where you sit in Luxembourg, Julie, there is this widespread sense that this is a turning point. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, well, I think that this deeper change for the better is not only possible, but clearly mandatory. And the mobilized capital so far is really enormous. If you look at the US and the 670 billion recovery plan with the famous PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, it's a huge amount. In the EU, the recovery plans foresee 750 billion euro for the next generation EU. So a lot of money is mobilized, which needs to be allocated and invested, of course, in sustainable activities, in sustainable projects, in order to tackle climate change and to create also sustainable jobs for the future. So overall, to have a true positive impact both on the environment and on society. We clearly need to make sure that we are getting results for the long term and not only for the short term. This is really what we should really clearly encourage. What is extremely important to understand is that saving jobs is one thing, while saving jobs for the long term means sustainable recovery. And that's where I join completely Alisa. It's a change of mindset, it's a change of culture, and let's not repeat the errors of the past.
Sure. Karen, how about you? Should we be now thinking it's essential that markets will start to serve humanity in a fuller sense? And is this the time for it?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure you would expect me to say so. I mean, I think we are on a scary trajectory, even before the pandemic, with serious climate change and the 6th mass extinction heading towards us. These are crises that we know are coming. So we really can't continue with business as usual. We do need a new kind of capitalism, one which delivers resilient and long-term prosperity within the constraints of our planet, rather than just maximizing profit and income in the short term, which is what the whole system pretty much seems set up to do at the moment, from the focus on GDP, which is a very short-term measure of national economic performance, through to quarterly reporting, which is an even more short-term focus for the corporate sector. So we need to address that, and we need to get the value of nature properly incorporated in economic decision making as well, because that's such a huge market failure that we have still failed to address, even despite knowing about it for many, many years. And the pandemic has really meant the rules of the game are up in the air. Actually, there's a lot of sort of new involvement of government in markets that they may not have otherwise wanted to do, and so it's a real opportunity for government to put in place the measures that will move us, catalyze a faster transition to a low carbon economy and a sustainable economy. So we really want to see the recovery packages embedding greater resilience and sustainability for the long term.
You mentioned the government involvement there. We'll definitely get onto that in a minute, but I wanted to just bring Mervyn in here and see what he has to say on that. I don't know whether sitting in Hong Kong, where you are at the moment, whether your view is slightly different there or presumably not.
I think there definitely can be. APAC, a lot of investors here are very focused on risk return. And I think that's important because ESG isn't just one thing, it's multiple different waves that are moving kind of in sync. And so you don't need to rethink capitalism to incorporate climate change and other ESG issues to your investment analysis, because with the way regulation is moving, the way that consumers are changing that behavior, there can be a risk return driven component to ESG investing. Now, that doesn't mean there's no debate on rethinking capitalism, because in Japan, for example, if I go for my kind of Asian examples, the GPIF have talked about this concept of universal ownership, which is we own so much of the economy that it doesn't matter about an individual asset outperforming. It's about trying to make the economy grow as much as possible. It's about growing the pie. And so that changes your view of capitalism, because I'm not just trying to do best for me, I'm trying to do best for everyone, because that's how you get long-term sustainable profit in the future. And so there is this variation.
The GPIF being the government pension fund, of course, just in
Japan.
Yeah. Please carry on.
No, I think that was it. I think it's just worth, when we talk about ESG, to distinguish a few different types of philosophies that kind of underpin the movement.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word movement, quite an interesting word. We've heard the phrase build back better a lot since March. And in fact, actually, some would strongly argue that it is now a genuine movement. But I'm wondering whether the panel think it will ever be more than just a nice phrase. I know that Joe Biden in the US is using it, the UK government is using it, the OECD is using it as well. But you know, apart from a nice phrase, do you think it will actually be? Will it mean anything genuinely? Karen, maybe I start with you there.
I really hope so. I think that the jury is sort of out. There's the sort of vivid green recovery tracker. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it shows the sort of scale of the stimulus that's green versus brown across a range of economies. And it shows that while some countries are doing quite well actually on the green front and minimizing the brown, including the UK and the EU, other countries are doing less well. A lot of other countries are doing less well and have had a very brown stimulus to date. So I do think the jury is out, but there is a lot of discussion about what can be done. And you know, the issue is that it's a real win-win actually to have a green stimulus, because you can create more jobs through you know, a low carbon transition and much more resilient jobs. You're not going to be investing in stranded assets. So it's such a big win-win. If we don't spend the money in this way, we're going to end up not being able to facilitate that transition, because there won't be any government money left over after COVID for a while. And so we're going to have huge climate change related costs after that to bear. And that's going to have potentially even more damaging and long-term impact on the whole global economy.
Alyssa, the phrase build back better, more than just a nice phrase?
I think what we've seen so far is a willingness to adopt it as a high level commitment. So for example, European member states have agreed that their recovery package will be consistent with the Paris Agreement and will avoid significant harm to climate and the environment more broadly. What's challenging is how that actually is put into practice and what conditionalities countries are willing to put on bailout funds and also on the long-term investment and spending plans. And that's the area at the moment where I think there's some very intensive negotiations going on across the different EU institutions and in member states. So it's actually a little bit hard to say, but I think we will be able to judge from the way they navigate potential trade-offs and the sort of detailed implementation of those high-level commitments. To give an example, one of the questions on the table at the moment or in recent years has been how the European Just Transition Mechanism should work. So this is the fund that's designed to support countries with very expensive transitions compared to other countries to transition away from coal and highly emitting assets. And there has been some genuine debate around whether there should be commitments that the country has signed up to net zero by 2050 to access the full suite of funding available under the Just Transition Mechanism. So there are very, very detailed questions being answered at the moment, which will, I think, evidence how serious Europe is about a green transition and about building back better.
Mervyn, is Build Back Better something that is going on in Asian conversations?
It is, but I think actually, I think one of the key differences in Asia is that there is a greater reliance on fossil fuels as energy generation in the first place. And so I think if we look at the global consensus, building back greener is probably quite a bit of consensus out there. Building back with less brown or the pace of decarbonization, I think that's where there is more debate. And I think this is linked to what Alyssa mentioned in terms of the perception of just transition, not just within nations, but across nations. How can we get to a political consensus where we all know climate change is an issue that needs to be tackled globally, but is there an agreement that everyone can reach where everyone is happy and shares in that gain? So I think until we can think of a solution where we build back better for everyone, it will be harder to build back better.
Okay. Julie, anything to add there?
Yeah, I completely agree. For me, it's not only build back greener, but clearly build back better to ensure societal prosperity and make it last. Make it last. Sorry, and it clearly requires a political will to do things differently, and to take the risks that maybe not all steps are considered as positive by all citizens, but it's also their responsibility to care for the long-term well-being of their nations and clearly undertake the right steps for sustainable recovery and development.
Sure. So I think all of you have said directly or indirectly around the role of governments here. So, which ties us in very nicely to the next question, which is ultimately the most powerful actors are governments, and a lot depends on what they do. Many policymakers and others call for economic stimulus and recovery measures after the coronavirus to be geared towards greening the economy, as we've touched on. But is this appropriate, and will it gain popular support or enough support when actually at the same time the urgent priority is to restore jobs? Mervyn?
Sure. And I think it's important to separate rescue packages and then the medium-term recovery package, which is over a number of years. Because with rescue package, I think rightly so, many of people have said the immediate urgent requirement is to stem the pain. It's to try and reduce layoffs and job losses. It's try to make sure everyone is okay during this pandemic. But when we move to recovery and it's about how spending is worth over 5 years or longer, then there's more of a conversation and there's less urgency in the sense that a package has to be done at exactly now. And so you see, as I think Alyssa mentioned, there's kind of actually Karen perhaps, where there's a variation in terms of how different countries have taken green objectives into their decision making. Now, I think when it comes to how governments are approaching this and thinking about recovery package, it's not always a trade-off, because if you go and do a recovery package where you're boosting jobs and boosting the economy in a way that is not sustainable, in the sense that it's not going to jobs that will exist in 5-10 years time, it's not using to build investment that's going to be there in 5-10 years time, it will be inefficient. So I think there is this conversation of how do we actually use the stimulus packages to get to a point where, in the new economy where things will operate in the future.
So the best of both worlds, really. You're restoring jobs, but those jobs are sustainable, as it were.
Not easy, but if you can.
I was going to say, is it possible? Is it just a pipe dream, do you think?
I think there is going to be, in terms of analysis of this stuff, there'll be better and there'll be worse options. And it's not going to be a completely easy step. But I think a perfect panacea for all our world's problems is a pipe dream, but doing better policy is not.
Okay, sure. Ellis, anything to add there?
Absolutely. I agree with a number of points that Mervyn's made there. I think it's completely appropriate that a major stimulus package of this sort is aligned with European policy objectives. I should also mention that investors have been incredibly positive and supportive overall of the need for a green transition. There's clear demand in the investment community for this, both in terms of the certainty of the policy trajectory, but also because it will open up investment opportunities and increase the number of projects and companies that are considered sustainable, which is a positive thing as well. Speaking again to Mervyn made a very good point about differentiating between bailout packages and medium to long-term stimulus. I mean, I think there are examples of smart ways of integrating sustainability even into bailout packages. There have been examples of, for example, seeking to avoid bailing out airlines which are competing with medium distance rail lines. So using that as an example, there's also a commitment by the Canadian government to require companies who are receiving bailout funds to disclose against the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, so to be clear about what their transition risk is. So I think there are some smart ways of integrating it. Over the medium to long term...
Is that enough of that happening, though? They're nice examples, but are there enough of those happening, in your opinion?
I think it's still to be seen. A lot of the detail around this will be playing out in individual member states in Europe. So there isn't a proposal on the table at the moment, as far as I'm aware, or there is no longer a proposal on the moment for a pan-European company bailout mechanism. So it will be determined on a case-by-case basis. And I think it will reflect, in many cases, the commitment of the member state to integrating sustainability. It's a difficult thing to measure at a sort of pan-European level.
Yeah.
But supporting Mervin's second point, again, I don't think it's necessarily always the case that there is a conflict between, or I don't think it is the case that there's a conflict between achieving sustainability outcomes and growth. I mean, the European Green Deal is not the European environment strategy, it's the European growth strategy. And I think it's critical that any substantial deployment of public funds is consistent with the stated objectives that the government has made.
Yeah, well, you've preempted me there by mentioning the European Green Deal. So let's move on to that quickly. And I'd like to ask, all our panelists, what will this European Green Deal look like in practice? What do we think? Why don't we ask Julie first of all? As I think geographically you're closest to Brussels, so you might have a better view on it than the rest of us.
Indeed. Well, I think that first we talked about the Building Back Better plan, which is absolutely necessary. The Green Deal is a bit different as it had been decided before COVID-19, and its goal is clearly to build EU in a green and sustainable way, as Ellis was just mentioning. So what is needed now is to clearly combine both. Use the leverage of the European Union by member states to build sustainable infrastructure, tackle climate change projects. And I think that's what it will look like, multiple projects that will be developed in every member state with a firing power much bigger than what was designed in the initial Green Deal. So to look at it positively, this is a unique chance of bringing Europe forward and keeping a competitive stance.
Okay. Do you have anything to add there, Karen? What do you think, or what should the European Green Deal look like in practice?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I've been following the UK recovery package more.
Probably an unfair question, sorry, but yeah.
I mean, I can comment from that point of view because I think, it's both about, as people have already said, investing government money in a way that speeds up the transition to a low carbon economy, de-risks the investment by the private sector. So I think we do need a lot of private money in this, not just public money, but public money can help to stimulate that push. So that's absolutely crucial. We also need these conditions in bailouts, as we've already been talking about, and we have seen that being put in place, and that has affected some of the negotiations that we are seeing with corporates who may or may not decide to go ahead with those bailouts, depending on the conditions that are attached. And thirdly, I think the other issue that's crucial is around this sort of bailout of countries, states, because there's going to be a huge amount of challenges with debt sustainability in light of this, and we've already seen some measures on that front. And I think we need to see a lot more creativity about how to move into a world where we are supporting the transition in other parts of the world as well, through the kinds of incentives and financing mechanisms that will support and incentivize the transition. So I think that's, given these debt bailouts and rescheduling packages that are going to be happening over the coming months, I think there's a huge opportunity to help support that wider transition. As Mervyn was saying, we need to find ways to ensure that that is incentivized globally, not just in a few countries that have the most fiscal means.
Okay.
I just want to follow up on Karen's point. She mentioned all the carrots. I think one of the interesting parts is the stick, because there's a lot of conversations about the fact that EU's climate ambitions can be different to a lot of different regions, and hence the conversation about the carbon border adjustment tax has been a popular one in terms of how can we retain EU competitiveness, particularly in global sectors, when other sectors are not, other regions are not doing the same. Given the politically complex world we live in, any carbon border adjustment tax is going to be part of a broader trade dialogue of a very complex system of international relations and trade. But it is a step and a sign where, like, can the EU transmit some of its climate ambition towards others through extraterritorial policy? I think that's a development that is really important in the future to continue observing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, we're all sort of painting a reasonably positive picture about what should happen, but I mean, should we though be encouraged or discouraged by the level of international cooperation during COVID-19 as a sign of how the world, or indeed inside Europe, can actually work together and deal with collective problems such as climate change or social problems. And I'd like to ask Julie that question, please.
Yeah, I think in COVID-19, you could observe different phases. The first one where everybody scrambled for the exit, in other words, help yourself.
Yeah.
Then we saw the second phase where we noted more solidarity, and it was more together we are stronger. And I guess, today it clearly appears that more intense international cooperation is necessary, not to say mandatory, to overcome the global problems like the pandemic, but also climate change. And this is also visible in the financial sector, where the Green Deal and the 750 billion euro, for instance, of the Next Generation EU program are based at the end on the solidarity principle. And on a side note, it's interesting to ask ourselves as well that I don't think that we would have thought about that Eurobond to be seen one day the light of the day. And you remember during the crisis with Greece, and we were talking a lot about the potential Eurobond, and now we may see it. So at the end, of course, lots of debate around all of this.
I'm not sure the Germans would call it a Eurobond, but carry on, please. Yeah.
But then, so I think this solidarity is visible as well in the financial sector, and at the end, it's nothing else that risk sharing in capital markets.
Yeah, there's definitely something that this crisis has brought about, is the concept of risk sharing. Yeah. Absolutely. But Alyssa, to my original point about, we're all talking about how the world can get better, which is international cooperation, etc. But the evidence, arguably, during the crisis, in the first 2 or 3 months of the crisis, was actually a total lack of cooperation and coordination, and it didn't look very good. Or would you disagree?
I think that's fair at an international level. I think we have seen an increase in a sort of some countries prioritizing their own interests over the international community. But to take a slightly more positive note, and that may be not where you're trying to go with this, I still think that the fact that Europe was able to come together and reach a shared agreement was actually quite significant. The deal that was agreed was by no means inevitable, and so the fact that Europe can still function in this way, can still establish a shared agreement based on principles of solidarity, and which is substantial in scale and likely to have a meaningful impact on the economy in the medium to long term, I think is still a very positive thing. But I would agree with you, internationally there needs to be much more cooperation.
Possible with the current setup? I say sort of fairly euphemistically.
I'm sorry, the line was bad. I didn't catch the second.
Sorry, would you be confident that is possible given the current political setup?
I think it will be challenging. I mean, if we're talking about a green recovery specifically, that hinges on a number of things, including the Paris Agreement. And if you're indirectly alluding to the US is obviously withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, or is in the process of doing so. And so I think it is challenging to have global cooperation around an international goal that some countries have not signed up to.
So Karen, if international cooperation was a thing you could mark out of 10, what would you give it over the last 5 months?
5.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, multilateralism generally is not doing very well at the moment, is it? So we do have a challenge there in addressing wider problems as well. I think another point just to make is that the Paris Club debt relief agreement with the G20 was a good example of some actual cooperation and solidarity, but even that is facing some challenges, and that's also from the sort of private creditors. So there's still a need for more solidarity in that dimension as well, between the responsibility of the private sector to help resolve this overall pandemic problem. But going back to the issue about multilateralism generally, and the need for better multilateralism to tackle climate change and nature risks, because I think that's one part of the global architecture that's really missing is a global mechanism to facilitate international transfers of finance and funds to invest in natural capital and the ecosystem services upon which our whole economy depends. Because some of the countries which have those natural assets, you know, other countries are benefiting from those, but not contributing towards them at all, or to their protection or restoration. So there is a strong need for a new kind of financing mechanism, or multiple mechanisms to do that. And at the moment, I feel we just don't really have the architecture in place to do that.
So what would be your sort of foundation blocks for that, for creating such an architecture?
Well, I mean, I think it's extremely politically challenging, because I think what you need really is countries who are big consumers of the benefits of natural capital. So importers of products that depend on natural capital need to contribute to their upkeep, if you like, you know, their sort of management as an asset. And so we need countries to take responsibility for their international footprint, the impact they have on nature and climate overseas, and to contribute according to that. So, you know, like a country's consumption and imports should help determine the level of contribution that's required. And that's obviously a very difficult thing to ask, you know, especially all the rich countries to do. It's going to be difficult to get them to sign up to that. But I think that's the kind of thing we need. And then a process, obviously, for working out how to invest those funds in a way that really maximizes the natural capital returns, the economic returns on that appropriately. And there are many mechanisms or like approaches and tools to do that, but it's just the political will really that is undermining that. So that's a fundamental flaw, I think, in our ability to tackle particularly the nature crisis and biodiversity loss.
Are you perhaps describing almost like a global subscription almost, that might already exist through something like the World Bank or even the United Nations?
Well, but I think we need the private sector more involved as well. So it's more of a sort of, and there are conversations like there's the Global Resources Initiative, which is a UK initiative is being developed. The UK is working with other governments to try and develop a more multilateral approach to that. So I think that's the kind of building blocks that would get companies to take responsibility for their supply chain as well. So, you know, it's part of a bigger picture, not just public and multilateral types of funding.
Ellis, anything to add there? Oh, sorry, no, Mervyn, let's hear from you.
I just want to add one point, and that is international cooperation isn't just tied to governments. We've got central banks, we've got private sector, financial institutions, voluntary groups, and depending on the issue, we're seeing progress. So the Network for Greening Financial System, in terms the NGFS of central banks, has really coordinated a lot of the work on climate scenario analysis, building on the work of the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate and Financial Related Disclosure. I think that's a positive sign of international cooperation amongst central banks dealing with a problem. I think recently we saw the IIF set up this working group of the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. Again, a very important one, because if you get a global carbon market right, and we've just published a report on this today actually, you can potentially reduce the cost of decarbonization significantly globally. And so, yes, of course, we have these government diplomatic challenges that we're seeing on the news every day, but there's also good signs in areas that are outside of government.
Okay. Thank you. So I'd like to slightly turn ourselves a little bit towards capital markets, given this is mostly a capital markets event. And we've all talked, haven't we, about sort of the green recovery, or wanting a green recovery, but do we think that a green recovery, will that lead to more issuance of green and social bonds? I think, Julie, you said that, you know, the European, sort of the 750 billion, for example, that the European Union is going to be issuing, arguably will be classified as green and or social or sustainable anyway. So maybe that's a start. But will this movement, if we can call it that, will it lead to more issuance of green and social bonds?
Well, yes, I'm convinced that this is clearly an opportunity to boost the sustainable finance market, from green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, and why not transition bond, by the way. So it will for sure, get to this major boost, which will be supported by investors. But investor trust, is built on transparency, and transparency is built on data. And the access to structured, meaningful, and comparable data is essential to make sustainable finance products credible and successful. And in this context, I'm extremely pleased and proud to share that at Lgx, we launched today the Lgx Data Hub, which is a centralized data hub for structured data points on a range of sustainable securities, including all green, social, and sustainability securities listed on Luxembourg and displayed on Lgx. And it will allow asset managers and investors to access to structured data with a very high level of granularity, and for them to be able to make very informed decisions, and also for reporting purposes. And you know that at least in Europe, disclosure regulation should enter into force in March 2021. So being able to find and collect those data in a centralized data hub where they find all they need and all what is relevant for them for reporting purposes is essential. So we used to say that data is gold, and I think this is very relevant for the sustainable finance products.
Thank you. Mervyn, what do you think about this? From where you sit at a rating agency, do you expect to see a lot more of this type of product coming through now?
So, in a short answer, yes, because when you ask a lot of people, one of the constraints for issuing green bonds is the lack of sufficient green projects to back up this use of proceeds. And so by definition, having more projects available allows for more green bonds to be issued. I would throw a spanner there and go, does that matter? Because if the policymakers are already putting so much money in green, it's leading to more green bonds, but you're not having the circular effect. It's not more green bonds and the green finance system building leading to faster transition. It's vice versa. I think the important part, what a lot of people have to ask themselves in sustainable finance is, how do we get the development of the green bond system and green finance system to accelerate the climate transition? So is it about trying to develop this consistent greenium where there is a positive impact for issuing green bond that has a financing impact? Or is it about allowing more transparency in the system and more and better understanding of the green portfolios of banks and the investment projects of companies so that people can make better environmental assessments? I think that is the challenge, because more green bonds, yay, but are we getting somewhere faster than we would have otherwise?
So actually, Karen mentioned them, transition bonds. So Mervyn, you're a fan of them? You think they're a good thing?
So I don't want to sit on the fence, but in an age, if you talk to a lot of Asian investors, they go, look, we understand that by investing in green technology to reduce the carbon costs of fossil fuels, it may slow the overall movement down compared to just fully moving to renewables, but it helps to balance some of the social economic consequences, because realistically, we can't decarbonize as quickly. And I think the debate is climate change such a big issue that we should just be going towards the fastest solution, or do we have to balance the social economic objectives, and how much? And so transition bonds, I think, is a way to tackle that second part, but whether it's the right policy path, I think there's a big debate to be had about that.
I mean, obviously, they're useful. Well, they can be applied all over the world, but as you've already said, Asia, very high carbon intensive industry. Transition bonds are a product that could actually be used extensively in Asia, given the makeup of the economy.
And most likely, at this stage, it sounds like the conversation is leading that way.
Yeah. Can I just come in on the green bonds question as well?
Yeah.
I think we're more interested in getting sustainability embedded in all bonds, not just scaling up a very small currently green bond market. And I just wanted to mention, we've been working with 91, the asset managers, on a climate and nature sovereign index, which is a way of assessing at the national level the sort of climate and environmental risks facing a country that might affect its future credit worthiness as a sovereign borrower, with a view to improving the basis for decision making by sovereign investors. And we think that's absolutely crucial, so that all kinds of sovereign investment is taking these kinds of risks into account. And there are some products out there, but they tend to be quite backward looking, whereas what we've done is build on some new modelling work that's doing forward-looking modelling of the impact of climate and nature loss on different countries of the world, and how that's likely to affect their economies and hence their credit worthiness. So that's just one mechanism to try and get this issue mainstreamed into all lending decisions. And I think that's the kind of approach we would really recommend.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Alyssa, would you have anything to add there?
I think I wanted to respond to some of Mervin's points on transition bonds, and I'd completely agree with that the transition to a low carbon economy is not only going to be achieved through investing in things that are already sustainable, but in financing the transition in a number of industries that are very hard to transition. The challenge, I think, with something like a transition bond is in being very clear around what the transition that we're talking about is. What is the end date and what is the carbon performance that it's expected? And if it's not a transition to net zero by 2050, for example, which is the EU's own carbon target, we need to be very clear about what it's transitioning to and when by. I think that's a critical piece of information that the market needs to have to be able to evaluate whether they want to be investing in this type of asset.
Okay, so I think we've got maximum of 10 minutes left. So we'll have a couple more questions if that's all right. So both governments and central banks have intervened in the economy in unprecedented ways during the pandemic. I'm wondering, panelists, will the relationship between the state and private capital markets change permanently? Do markets now regard it as their right to be bailed out, and what will that be expected? And will that be expected in even lesser crises? Mervyn?
The old moral hazard conversation. I remember financial crisis back in the 07 to 11 period, where this was a hot topic of debate, right? And it was very focused on banks, and that's how we ended up with the push for Dodd-Frank, too big to fail, big banks, and all that conversation. Didn't necessarily get too far with that, but the conversation about moral hazard is there. And so I think, quoting Carmen Reinhardt, I think there's a lot of the time where every time there is these incidents, this time is different. It's a special case. We need to have a bailout because of such issues. And I think there is this question mark of, okay, well, to what extent should bondholders and equity investors be asked to absorb losses in this sort of environment? I don't think there's a clear answer, because, like, similar to the debate back in 07, if you just let entities fail, well, when security holders don't expect it, you could have huge financial disruption, right? You can have locked up of the money markets, you can have a lot of pain, but is that the same amount of pain as allowing the moral hazard to continue? Beyond my pay grade, but definitely an interesting question.
Yeah. How about you, Julie? Do you think now that do you think markets now regard it as their right to be bailed out?
Very difficult to answer. I completely agree with what Mervyn was explaining, especially as the market infrastructure, where we have to find the right balance between investor protection and at the same time allowing issuers, of course, to access market, trying to, of course, monitor markets in this high volatility time where we need to maintain this market integrity and freedom. So of investors should remain responsible of their choices as well. I completely agree with Mervyn. So it's very difficult to answer. I think, anyway, we saw very different crises, very different nature, very different size of crises, and each time they were very good excuse to intervene. So this is clearly a big disruption with what we knew and we faced in the past. Don't have the crystal ball, even if I'm a marketplace.
Sure.
So very difficult to answer.
Yeah. Okay. Karen, is this sort of development very dispiriting for an organisation such as yourselves, though?
Which development specifically?
Well, the sort of, you know, the markets now regard it as their right to be bailed out.
Yeah, I don't know if I see that exactly, because I feel as though A, the governments are likely to try and extricate themselves as quickly as possible. B, this is a pandemic. This is a kind of one-off crisis that we do still currently expect to recover from, question mark, but anyway, hopefully. Whereas climate change is a much more ongoing, continually worsening crisis. So I don't think bailing out is going to work for very long. We're literally going to run out of money. So it's going to need a different way of approaching it. It is a massively systemic challenge. So regardless of whether they would like to be bailed out. And even then, I think, at least in the UK, where there have been conditions put on companies who get bailouts, they have decided not to take those bailouts sometimes, because so they obviously don't see it as a right, but as something that they need to work for to some extent.
Yeah, so I guess where I was trying to go with my question was that the world, or at least Europe or the UK, has shown themselves incredibly fast and committed to bailing out the economies, threatened by this pandemic. Shouldn't they be doing the same on a climate change basis? Shouldn't they be showing the same commitment and sort of magnitude towards preventing climate change, which arguably will be a bigger killer and more damaging to the global economy than what we're experiencing right now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it is potentially much bigger, and they can avert it. Whereas on this one, we weren't expecting it, although I guess we get pandemics every so often, but it is much more unexpected than climate change in many ways, which we're already seeing happening increasingly. So it is amazing, really, that more effort isn't being put into averting climate change. And hopefully the pandemic will help us to realize our vulnerability as a global economy and community, and to recognize the importance of investing for resilience, and putting in place the right kinds of financial and economic policy mechanisms that build resilience, rather than, as I said right at the beginning, the sort of short-term profit, don't worry about the future. Actually we need to be careful, because we're going to suffer unless we get to grips with these problems.
Yeah, so going full circle, do you think enough of the right people have made that connection between climate change and the fact that because of climate change we're going to see more of these types of pandemics?
No, not yet. I mean, that is a key point. Climate change and nature loss are both contributing to these kinds of problems. Yeah, and I'm not sure that link has been made by as many people as we need, for sure. But I think there's also a problem that even when people get the costs and risks, still the change doesn't necessarily happen for all sorts of political economy reasons, vested interest reasons. The economic system has inbuilt incentives which prevent action. So there's a lot that needs to change to really enable us to address these things properly, unfortunately.
So Alyssa, the big focus should be, going forward, investing in resilience, which is a direct sort of learning point from the pandemic. Would you agree with that?
I think it's definitely a very significant part of what needs to happen next. I mean, I think I'd support some of Karen's points in particular. I think one of the key learnings from the pandemic is that delaying action on the basis of protecting the economy actually doesn't work. What we found almost universally is that the countries that imposed restrictions sooner were able to exit those restrictions sooner, and therefore able to get back to normal sooner, and generally haven't had as bad a time with the pandemic and the impacts on the economy. And I think climate change is exactly the same. There is a belief that we can somehow delay this and not incur economic costs. And in fact, the economic costs are increasing the longer we leave it to take meaningful action. So I'm strongly hoping that this is one of the lessons that we can take from this around how we address the climate crisis.
Mervyn, final comment?
I agree, and I think it kind of goes to a point. Effectively, inaction or inertia is a choice, right? It's an active choice which leads to consequences, and it's not about waiting enough and doing some waiting long enough and not do anything, because the waiting has its costs.
Okay, well, I think we might finish there. I think that's a fantastic debate. Thank you very much, all of you. We will now be moving on to the live Q&A with our audience. So before we open that up, I'd just like quickly to say thank you very much to Alyssa, Julie, Mervyn, and Karen for joining me. And please, everyone, feel free to ask us questions, and we'll be very happy to answer. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the live Q&A session we have after our first panel. I hope you enjoyed the panel. I'm very happy to say that I've been joined for the live Q&A by Alyssa, Karen, and Mervyn. Hi, everyone, again. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to maybe just start on a subject we sort of touched on, really, but I'd like to go into a bit more depth, if you don't mind, which is what are the big investment opportunities that should be tackled first, and what are the constraints in the way? A key word, I guess, is adaptation and financing that adaptation. But Karen, what do you think? What are the big investment opportunities?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we did a study with Vivid Economics looking at the opportunities to create jobs and stimulate the low carbon transition. And that was even before the pandemic, but we've updated that analysis now to look at what could quickly create jobs, and some of the opportunities that we identified are, obviously there's a lot of opportunities in things like green buildings and energy efficiency measures, where there's lots of shovel-ready projects out there that can help to really tackle the emissions and get us onto a track to net zero, and at the same time create a lot of jobs in the short term. So we showed, for example, that green buildings could support around 85,000 jobs. And I think heating and cooling systems as well could add a further 7,000 jobs. Supporting investment in electric vehicles would support around 11,000 jobs. And battery and charging technologies could support another 5,000 jobs. So there's a lot of opportunity for real win-wins from investing in the low carbon transition in a way that creates jobs and helps us to grow our way out of the pandemic. And we'd also love to see investment in nature-based solutions, which can also help tackle climate change and create jobs, things like protecting and restoring forests and soils and wetlands and rivers and coastal realignment schemes. So there's a whole set of shovel-ready projects that we, along with Link, have put into government as well, suggesting some projects that could be funded there.
Mm. Do you think, Karen, the financing community likes the projects that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think many of them do generate a positive financial rate of return, for sure. But this is public investment we're talking about for the fiscal stimulus, of course, as well. Yeah. So it generates a high economic rate of return, for sure. Whether the financial rate of return is as strong as some might want it to be is obviously an open question on some of them, particularly the nature-based solutions. They often don't generate quite as high a financial return as they should because of externalities in the market, of course. So those benefits don't fall to the investor necessarily until policies create those incentives and that financing incentive. So we need policies to really support that if we want to build in private investment into these things alongside the public money. But public money can help catalyse and kickstart that and de-risk it for private investors.
Yeah. Mervyn, how about you?
I do broadly agree with what Karen mentioned in terms of shovel-ready projects. I think there are a few things that, if we can get right, would be hugely beneficial. One thing would be, say, something like battery technology, which would suddenly make something like renewables, which marginal cost-wise is already very competitive, be able to use as a baseload fuel source, which really just changes the game. Like, obviously, that's different to the more kind of shovel-ready projects that Karen's talking about. But in terms of investment in research and technology, those sort of big-ticket items do really matter. And then there's the difference between public and private investment. I think Karen mentioned some of the more private focused projects. I think public investment, in terms of the what they could also need to focus on, will be things like infrastructure and having the right grid infrastructure to be able to build the economies of scales necessary that allows a whole renewable energy focused energy system to function. So I think, yeah, different horses, different courses when it comes to the investor, but there's kind of a multitude of things that need to be needs money to go into.
Yeah. What about you, Alyssa? We haven't heard from you on this.
So, I mean, I definitely agree with the sectors that the other panelists are mentioning. We've done some work with our own members on this. Interestingly, the first time we asked them, what are the big opportunities in a post-COVID world? Actually, the answer we got was healthcare and technology, which I think was responding to the trends that have arisen because of the pandemic, not the things that are going to get us through a green recovery. But then when we dug deeper, I think a lot of the investors that we've worked with are very keen to work through the jobs lens, exactly as Karen says, and have identified things like real estate and green renovation as being particularly positive. In terms of the challenges though, a couple of points. I mean, one is that we have this very, very big number for the amount of private financing that needs to be part of the Green Deal, even before the coronavirus pandemic. And it includes an awful lot of different things. It includes some very small scale opportunities, which just aren't big enough for your typical institutional investor to get involved in. So there needs to be something around aggregation. It involves things that will make a competitive rate of return. It involves things that will really be too high risk for your average institutional investor, and where a really careful and targeted deployment of public finance can support and develop those types of technologies so that they become the scale and the sort of reliability that's necessary for institutional investors to start to get involved. And I think one of the critical questions we still have is, how do we map those investment needs? We have these very high level figures, but we think an awful lot more needs to be done to work out what are the specific investment needs in the specific communities, what are the different tools that we can deploy, public, private, standardization, improving harmonization of labels and so on, that can really enable all of the different actors to work together in support of the overall goal. So a few reflections there.
Yeah, okay. Look, we've obviously spent the last many of us have spent the last 6 months working almost entirely at home, or mostly at home and a little bit in the office. Maybe some people are returning fully to the office now, but the feeling I get is that most of us are working more from home than in the office, but depends what you do, of course, as a job. But I'm just wondering, panel, and my last question, but you know, this shift that we've seen over the last 6 months of more working from home and less travel, is this a permanent shift? And if so, is there a risk that this will damage economic growth just when we need economic growth to pull us out of the mess that we find ourselves in? Let's start with you, Alyssa, please. You're working from home, I see right now.
I am working from home right now. I have a somewhat positive spin on this. I don't know if you're familiar with the study that looks at tube strikes. Every time there's a tube strike in London, productivity goes up slightly as a result. And that's because it forces a certain number of people to test a new way of getting to work that is more efficient. That means they get in quicker, they're able to do more work. And so I'm, in some ways, maybe a little bit naively positive, because I think that what this has given us is a gigantic opportunity to experiment and to test ideas that wouldn't have been conceivable otherwise. So if we take that very small example of London tube strikes and globalize it, I think there are some positive lessons in there.
Okay, thank you. Karen, as at a guess, I'd say you're also working from home right now.
Yeah, that's right. You can probably see the picture of the goats behind me. Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is likely to stick for the longer term, because I think people are realizing the advantages, you know, some people at least are realizing the advantages of working at home, realizing how easy it is in some ways, for some types of jobs only, you know, but probably quite a few office jobs, it is easy to work from home, actually, at least part of the time. And, you know, obviously there's a huge opportunity where we need to cut down on especially global travel, you know, and we can do all these virtual events sitting in our own office, you know, at home, without damaging the planet. So that's a huge advantage. And I think people are surely now sort of able to see that it can be done, and it has less personal cost as well than going on all these trips where you don't have to give up weeks or days, whole days traveling somewhere and then, you know, getting jet lagged and everything, missing out on seeing your kids. Now you can do it from home, and you can do more events, so it's made more productive as well. Obviously you miss out on some aspects of it, the sort of you know, meetings in the corridors and all that, and then networking, but there's many other advantages. So I think this probably will lead to a long-term shift. And obviously there are going to be some economic costs, but it's also going to help to save us from, you know, catastrophic climate change. So that's got to be a massive upside as well that we've got to factor in.
Mervyn, you're definitely joining us from home because you're in Hong Kong where it is 10 o'clock at night. First of all, thank you for staying up so late and talking to us again. But yeah, to you, I mean, Hong Kong and Asia, especially Hong Kong, is sort of a hub to go and visit the rest of Asia for business. Is that going to change?
It's an interesting one because I think right now, I think even from a personal anecdote, just working in the office, there is a lot more acceptance of virtual meetings, even in countries where there has always been this protocol to be having face-to-face. Now, whether that changes in a year or 2 years' time as things recover, I think that's an open question. I think we have, actually, if we look at, even before the pandemic, some of the structural trends that were going on that we were capturing in our ESG relevance scores, things like the move away from bricks and mortar shops towards online shopping was already impacting commercial property rents and a lot of shops on the high streets. There were a number of personal travel was probably increasing, business travel going kind of gradually on the other way before. But there was kind of a lot of trends that even before the pandemic we were moving towards. Now, I think you can argue that the pandemic can accelerate this because a lot more people had to experience a new normal, and then the new normal becomes something that's easier to adjust to. But I think when it comes to the economy, the question would be what new economic elements basically get created because of what we're doing. So it could be kind of broadband and other remote infrastructure that becomes the expansion instead of what we've had before. It could be, I don't even know, delivery companies for food, those sort of, like I think it's just because there's a shift in economy where there will be different sectors that will lose out, doesn't mean there isn't going to be new sectors being created to kind of accommodate the new trends.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, you know, we talked about building back better, but are you worried the economy as a whole is moving in a very antisocial direction, destructive of jobs? For example, with online shopping replacing local shops, as you mentioned, with robotic jobs or even actual robots.
It's an interesting one. People talk about robots, but kind of if we go back through history and we talk about, okay, the loom got replaced by, textile workers when the loom got replaced by machinery. It meant that new jobs got created and new sectors got created because labor resources could be replaced and moved towards elsewhere. Now, I think there's a very, very fair argument to say that how well does our economic and systems and institutions allow for people to relocate and reskill quickly? Maybe not in a lot of instances, and there's going to be a challenge there. But if we're talking about the 20, 50-year time frame, economies, when there's impacted by technological change, often find new roles and new sectors to fill labor resources.
John actually asks another question, which is, Karen talked about needing a cultural change, but that usually takes years. How do we get something of the scale of cultural change, but really quickly? Karen, can I ask you that question? If you indeed heard my question?
I did, I heard it, thanks, yes.
Good.
Yes, well, a pandemic might speed up a cultural change. It's really changed the rules of the game already, I would say, in really quite drastic ways that you could not have foreseen. And governments who were previously, you know, not very amenable to the idea of intervening in the economy are now intervening massively. You know, people are working at home and doing things differently. It's forcing us to innovate around the way we work and around the way we socialize. And so I think this is a big change moment for the whole society. And so that's why it's such an important opportunity to grasp, to make sure that it leads to the kind of long-term changes that we need to put ourselves onto a more sustainable trajectory. So yeah, we need some careful management of that process, and not to just, there's probably a tendency amongst many to want to get back to the old ways as quickly as possible. You know, that's what recovery looks like. I think we need to be more open and creative and think about the new ways of doing things that could be better, and try and help support that to happen. Like just going back to the previous conversation about jobs and the impact on jobs of people not traveling so much, perhaps that it will open up local business opportunities, not in London, but in the city capital, but in outside, in the countryside or in the smaller towns, which will help to stimulate the high street. Who knows? There's a lot of different potential ways this might play out, and we do need to move towards a new kind of economy that's not based on material consumption, but based more around, experience goods and well-being and quality of life, and less on just consuming more and more stuff all the time, because that isn't going to be sustainable, as we're now understanding more and more. So I think this is a good moment to try and bring some of those changes about.
Well, thank you, Karen. That's probably a very good moment to stop right there, our live Q&A. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alyssa, Karen and Mervyn, for joining us again. And Mervyn, I hope you can now go and get some sleep. We're actually going now into our second panel of the day, moderated by my excellent colleague, John Hay. And it's entitled, Does COVID Change ESG or Reinforce It? Thank you.